I want to open with a question, because that is how this whole business started, and because you deserve to sit with it the same way I had to. What do you do when the enemy is not a weapon, and not a monster, and not even a countdown you can watch tick toward zero? What do you do when the enemy is simply time, stretched out flat and featureless in front of you, with no edge you can see and no way to know if it ends in 3 days or 3 years? My name is Tarn Osley. I am the operations chief of Meridian Relay 7, a fueling and communications waystation parked in the cold dark between 2 shipping lanes that matter to almost nobody except the freight companies that use them. I have run this station for 19 years. In that time, I have handled hull breaches, pirate scares, 3 separate outbreaks of a fungal growth that got into the recycling ducts and made everyone's quarters smell like wet stone, and 1 memorable incident involving a Yearn cargo hauler who tried to bring an entire crate of live shellfish through customs as an emotional support delicacy. I have handled all of that, and I want you to understand that I do not say it to boast. I say it because it means I had, by the time this story starts, developed a fairly accurate sense of my own limits. I knew what kind of crisis I could handle with training and protocol, and I knew, roughly, where those things stopped being enough and something else had to take over. I had never once, in 19 years, needed to find out what that something else actually was. I had simply assumed, the way most administrators assume, that if the day ever came, I would rise to it, because that is what the job requires of you, and because I had never been given a reason to doubt it. None of that prepared me for a human named Renna Achabe. She came through on a transit shuttle, a passenger, nothing more. Her actual destination was a mining colony 4 jumps past us. She was supposed to be on my station for 6 hours, long enough to make a connection, drink something hot, and complain about the food, which every transit passenger does, regardless of species, because bad food is apparently a universal constant of space travel. She was still here 4 months later. I am going to tell you what happened during those 4 months, because I think it matters, and because I think most of the galaxy still does not understand what it learned out here, on a relay station nobody has heard of, about a species everyone assumed they already understood. Let me back up and give you the station itself, because you need to picture it properly. Meridian Relay 7 is a wheel, 6 decks wrapped around a central spine, home to a rotating crew of 11 and whatever transit traffic happens to be passing through on a given week. It is not glamorous. It smells faintly of machine oil and recycled air no matter how many filtration cycles you run. It has exactly 1 observation lounge with real windows, and everyone on the crew treats time in that lounge like a rationed luxury, because it is the only place on the station where you can look at something other than a corridor. My crew, at the time, was small and settled into its grooves the way crews get after years together. Bosk Farron ran cargo logistics, a Drenic hauler built wide and low, 4 arms, plating like river stone, and a nervous system that did not handle enclosed spaces well despite having chosen a career that was, almost entirely, enclosed spaces. Alirathes handled trade contracts, a Kailu, sharp-eyed and permanently unimpressed, the kind of person who negotiated shipping rates the way other people breathed. And Ovette, our systems assistant, a neural, small and quiet, who communicated through slow pulses of bioluminescent color along a translucent carapace, because the neural do not have voices in any sense the rest of us would recognize. Renna arrived on a Tuesday, station time, which meant nothing, because we do not have days out here, only shift cycles, but I remember it as a Tuesday because that was the word she used for it later, and it stuck. She was unremarkable in every visible way. Medium height. Dark hair pulled back. A canvas bag slung across one shoulder that she never let out of arm's reach, for reasons that would later make a great deal more sense to me than they did that first day. She thanked the shuttle pilot by name. She asked Ovette, unprompted, what the color patterns meant, and when Ovette pulsed out something like curiosity mixed with mild surprise, she said, "That's a nice color for it," which is not a sentence that means anything in isolation, except that Ovette's carapace flickered a shade I had never seen from them before, and kept flickering it for the better part of an hour. I noted it. I did not think much of it. Passengers are often friendly in the first hour. It rarely survives contact with our coffee. 6 hours later, the asteroid came through. I should clarify. It was not a large asteroid, by the standards of things that end stations. It was, according to the post-incident report I filed later, a fragment roughly the size of a delivery pod, moving fast enough and at an angle unlucky enough to punch through our secondary shield array before clipping the outer housing of the fusion core. It did not breach the core. I want to be clear about that immediately, because I do not want you spending the next several chapters worried about an explosion that never happened. What it did was worse, in its own quiet way. It knocked the core's regulation coil out of alignment, which meant the core began running hot and unstable, which meant we had to shut it down entirely before it did something dramatic and permanent, which meant we lost primary power, long-range communications, and most of our life support redundancy, all within about 4 minutes. I was in the command ring when it happened. I felt the whole station shudder, heard the groan of metal settling into a shape it was not built to hold, and watched every status light on my board turn the specific shade of amber that means, in station operations language, this is going to be a very long day. The backup systems chorus. That is what backup systems are for. We had air, we had heat, we had enough stored power to keep the lights on and the recyclers running. What we did not have, what the impact had taken from us completely, was our long-range transmitter array, which meant we could not call for help. We had a short-range beacon still cycling, broadcasting our position and status to anything passing within a modest radius. But Meridian Relay 7 sits in a corridor that sees, on average, 1 ship every 11 days. We had just lost the ability to reach anyone farther than that. I gathered the crew in the observation lounge, because it seemed important to say what needed saying somewhere with windows, somewhere you could see the stars still doing exactly what they always did, indifferent to us entirely. I told them what I am telling you now. We were stable. We were not in immediate danger. But we did not know when help would come, and we needed to start acting like people who might be waiting a while. Bosk's plating made a sound I associate, after years of working with him, with barely restrained panic. Alira crossed her arms and asked, with the flat calm of someone already calculating supply margins in her head, how long a while might mean. Ovet's carapace dimmed to a color I did not have a name for yet, but which I would come to recognize, over the following weeks, as the neural expression for held breath. And Rena Achabi, transit passenger, 6-hour layover, for months early into a delay nobody had asked her opinion on, sat down cross-legged on the floor of the lounge, opened her bag, took out a small paper notebook, and asked, in a voice that had no urgency in it whatsoever, "Okay, what do we actually know?" I did not know, in that moment, that I was watching the beginning of something. I thought she was in shock. I thought the calm was a symptom, not a resource. I was wrong about that in ways I am still learning to be embarrassed about. I have spent a long time, since, trying to explain to other administrators what it was like living through the first week of the blackout, and the closest I have come is this. Imagine every alarm in your life going off at once, and then imagine one person in the room whose pulse does not change. That was Rena, for the first week. Not cheerful. Not oblivious. She understood exactly how bad our situation was, better than most of us, in some ways, because she asked questions the rest of us were too proud or too frightened to ask out loud. How much water did we actually have, accounting for recycling losses? How much stored power, at minimum draw, before the recyclers themselves became a luxury we couldn't afford? What happened to morale, practically speaking, in a sealed environment with no fixed end date? She asked Alira that last one directly, on the second day, while we were doing inventory in the number 3 storage bay. Alira, who did not suffer fools and had already decided, out loud, more than once, that humans were an overrated species propped up by good publicity, looked at her for a long moment before answering. Kailu don't do well with open timelines, Alira said. We like contracts. Start dates, end dates, penalty clauses. A crisis with no end date is, to us, indistinguishable from a crisis that will never end. Rena nodded like this was useful information rather than a confession. Okay, she said. Then we give it fake end dates. Small ones. Something to hit every few days, even if the real deadline is unknown. Alira opened her mouth, I assumed to say something dismissive, and then closed it again, because she had already started doing the math, and the math, annoyingly, made sense. That was the first thing I noticed about Rena Achabi. She did not try to make the situation smaller than it was. She made it smaller pieces instead. By the end of the first week, she had built what she called, without any apparent sense of irony, a rhythm. Fixed meal times, even though our supplies did not strictly require them. Fixed sleep cycles, synced as closely as 6 very different species biology would allow. A rotating job board, chalked onto a bare section of bulkhead in the number 2 corridor, that assigned small, mostly unnecessary tasks to everyone on a 2-day cycle. Bosk got inventory counts. Ovet got the water reclamation logs. Alira, to her visible irritation, got morale check INS, which meant walking the corridors once a shift and simply talking to people, a task she treated initially as a punishment and eventually, though she never once admitted this to me directly, as the best part of her day. I asked Rena once why the tasks mattered, when half of them didn't strictly need doing. Doesn't matter if they need doing, she said. Matters that they get done. There's a difference between waiting for something and doing something while you wait. Only one of those eats you alive. I wrote that down. I have it in my log, word for word, because it was the first time I understood that what I was watching was not a coping mechanism improvised under stress. It was a method. Practiced. Deliberate. The kind of thing you only build if you have needed it before, more than once, for longer than 6 hours at a time. I asked her, carefully, where she had learned it. She was quiet for a moment, turning a stone over in her fingers. She carried a handful of small, smooth stones in her bag, and I had noticed her stacking them, absently, into little towers during quiet moments, though I did not yet know why. My grandmother, she said finally. She used to talk about droughts. Long ones. Years, not weeks. She said the people who survived them weren't the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones who figured out how to build a normal life inside an abnormal one. Everyone else burned out waiting for it to end. She set the stack of stones down, 4 of them, balanced with more care than the gesture seemed to warrant. I think humans are just built for the long wait, she said. We've had a lot of practice. I did not understand, then, how much practice she meant. I understand now. It is in nearly every chapter of human history, if you go looking, though she never once made me look. She simply lived it, quietly, in front of us, until we could not help but notice. I want to give you one more piece of that first week, because I think it explains something the rest of this account will otherwise leave unclear, namely, why a crew of 5 very different species, none of whom had chosen to trust a stranger with anything before, began, so quickly, to organize their days around a passenger who had no rank, no authority, and technically no reason to still be aboard our station at all. It was not charisma, in the sense I had understood the word before. Rena did not command a room. She did not raise her voice, did not perform confidence for an audience, did not seem to particularly care whether anyone was watching her at all. What she did, instead, was notice things nobody else had time to notice, and then quietly fix the smallest, most fixable piece of whatever she had found. She noticed, on day 3, that Bosk ate his rations alone in the cargo bay rather than the mess hall, and instead of commenting on it, she simply began eating hers there too, without announcement, until eating in the cargo bay became something the 2 of them did together, and then, gradually, something the whole crew rotated through, until the cargo bay had its own informal mealtime with its own informal rules about who told the worst stories. She noticed that Ovet's water reclamation logs, though flawless, were never once acknowledged by anyone before she started acknowledging them, and she noticed that the acknowledgement itself seemed to matter to a species most of the crew had quietly assumed, before her arrival, did not experience things like being overlooked. She noticed that I, personally, had not slept a full cycle since the impact, because I kept the command ring status board open in my quarters out of habit, and on day 5 she left, outside my door, without comment, a single ration bar and a note that said only, "The board will still be there in 6 hours. Go to sleep, Tarn." I have kept that note. It is folded into my log, tucked behind the biometric printouts nobody else ever reads. I am somewhat embarrassed to admit how much it mattered. None of these were large gestures. None of them, on their own, would have been worth writing into an official report. But 4 months is a very long time, and it turns out that a crew does not hold together because of one large act of courage. It holds together because someone, every single day, does the small unglamorous work of noticing what everyone else is too frightened or too proud to say out loud, and quietly makes it a little easier to carry. The stones, I should explain, because they become important later, and because I promised you a proper accounting. Every evening, ship's evening, our arbitrary marker for the end of a work cycle, Rena would take 1 stone from her bag and add it to a small stack she kept on the observation lounge windowsill. 1 stone, 1 day survived. She never announced this ritual. I only noticed it because I spent a great deal of my own evenings in that lounge, staring at the stars and trying not to think about transmitter arrays. By day 9, the stack had 9 stones. By day 20, it had grown into 3 separate small towers, because a single stack that tall apparently offended her sense of architecture. Bosk asked her once what the stones were for. "Marking time," she said. "So the weight has a shape. It's easier to carry something with a shape." Bosk, who to that point had regarded Rena with the polite, distant tolerance a Drenic hauler affords most things smaller than himself, looked at the little towers for a long moment. The next evening, when Rena reached for a stone, there were 2 new ones sitting beside her bag, placed there with what I can only describe as enormous, deliberate casualness by someone the size of a cargo loader trying very hard to look like he had not just done something sentimental. She added both to the stack without comment. Bosk's plating made the low grinding sound I had, by then, learned to associate with something in him settling into place. The stack grew every day after that. Sometimes Alira added a stone. Once, memorably, Ovette brought one, a smooth dark piece of ceramic salvaged from a broken relay housing, because the Neural do not go outside to gather stones, and this was, in its way, the closest thing to a gift Ovette had ever given anyone on the crew. I want you to hold on to the image of that windowsill, because we will come back to it. Everything in this story comes back to it, eventually, the way everything in a long wait comes back to the small fixed points you build to survive it. I need to tell you about the greenhouse module, because it is the second thing Rena built during those early weeks, and because I did not understand its importance until it was nearly too late to matter. Meridian Relay 7 has a small horticultural bay, Deck 4, intended for growing a modest supply of fresh vegetables to supplement the preserved rations that make up most of a relay crew's diet. It had, before the impact, been functional but unremarkable. 6 growing trays, a modest irrigation loop, enough output to make our meals slightly less depressing. The impact had knocked its climate regulation offline, and in the chaos of the first days, nobody had prioritized fixing it. We had bigger problems. Water reclamation, power draw, hull integrity checks. A tray of half-dead lettuce did not make the list. Rena put it back on the list. She spent 2 full shift cycles in that bay during week 2, alone, with a toolkit she had more or less commandeered from Bosk stores and a manual she had pulled from the station archive and read cover to cover, which I only discovered because Ovette mentioned, in passing color pulses that I had by then learned to interpret with reasonable accuracy, that the human had been asking very specific questions about nutrient cycling. I went down to check on her progress, mostly out of professional obligation, and found her elbow deep in the irrigation housing, muttering to herself the way she did when she was working through a problem out loud. "You don't have to do this," I told her. "It's not essential systems." She did not look up. "Everything's essential eventually," she said. "You just don't know which thing yet." I did not press her further. I had learned, by then, that arguing with Rena's calm was like arguing with a closed door. You could knock as long as you liked, but it opened on its own schedule, not yours. I stayed longer than I meant to that shift, mostly because I had run out of urgent things to do elsewhere and found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did not want to leave. She talked while she worked, not to me particularly, more the way people talk to fill a quiet room, and I learned more about growing things in those 2 hours than I had in 19 years of overseeing a station that grew them. She told me about soil, actual dirt, the kind her grandmother had apparently kept in a plot behind a house on Earth, and how it was less a substance than a slow, patient argument between 1,000 different small forms of life, none of which hurried, all of which somehow, eventually, produced something that could feed a person. "You can't rush dirt," she said, elbow deep in the irrigation housing. "You can only give it what it needs and get out of its way." I think that's most of what actually works, in most situations. Give it what it needs. Get out of the way. Check back tomorrow. "That sounds like something you'd put on a poster," I said, mostly to see if she would laugh. She did laugh, briefly, a real one, the first I had heard from her since the impact. My grandmother had a version of it stitched onto a pillow. I used to think it was corny. Turns out it's just true, and true things sound corny until you need them. She got the climate regulation working again by the end of the second cycle. It was not much. 6 trays, modest yield, enough to add a handful of fresh greens to our rotation every few days. I logged it as a minor quality of life improvement and did not think much more about it. This turns out to have been, in retrospect, one of the least accurate assessments I have made in 19 years of service. I want to pause here and tell you about the crew's actual relationship with Rena during this period, because it did not happen all at once, and I do not want to give you the impression that everyone simply fell in line behind a human within the first month. That is not how trust works, and it is certainly not how a Kailu trader's trust works. Alira remained skeptical for a long time. She respected the results. The rhythm Rena had built was, undeniably, keeping the crew functional in a way that raw willpower alone would not have, but she distrusted the ease of it. Kailu culture runs on the assumption that anything valuable comes with a cost clearly stated up front, and Rena's calm did not seem to cost her anything visible, which Alira found, frankly, suspicious. "You never seem afraid," Alira said to her, near the end of week 3, in a tone that was less compliment than accusation. "I'm plenty afraid," Rena said. I just don't let it drive. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. Rena shrugged, stacking a stone onto the windowsill tower, the motion so practiced by then it had become almost invisible. Background noise. The way breathing is background noise. Being afraid doesn't get us water. Doing the next thing gets us water. So I do the next thing, and I let the fear ride along in the backseat instead of the front. Alira did not have a response to that. I watched her turn it over for several seconds, the particular stillness she got when a piece of information did not fit her existing model of the universe and she was deciding whether to discard it or rebuild around it. She rebuilt around it. I know this because 2 weeks later, during a supply dispute with Bosk over ration allocation that was threatening to become genuinely ugly, I watched Alira stop mid-argument, visibly catch herself, and say, in a voice that clearly cost her something, "Let's do the next thing instead of the whole problem." It was not her phrase. It had become her phrase anyway. Bosk's trust came differently, and faster, because Bosk's fear was the loudest in the room and Rena had addressed it directly, early, without making him feel small for having it. I found them together in the number 3 corridor during a minor power fluctuation in week 2, the lights dimming and stuttering in a way that made the walls feel closer than they were. Bosk's breathing had gone ragged, his plating rattling faintly with a tremor I recognized as the beginning of a full claustrophobic episode. Rena was sitting on the floor beside him, not touching him, not crowding him, just present, talking in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular. The stones, the greenhouse, a story about a place on Earth called a desert where the sky went on so far it made people feel like they could finally breathe. "It's not really about the space," she was saying, as I arrived. "It's about your brain deciding there's no way out. So we give your brain a way out. Even a fake one. You focus on my voice instead of the walls, and the walls stop being the whole world for a minute." Bosk's breathing slowed. Not immediately, not smoothly, but it slowed. He did not thank her, in words. Drenic culture does not run heavily on verbal gratitude. But the next day, unprompted, he redesigned the corridor lighting rig so that during power fluctuations, the dimming happened gradually instead of in a sudden lurch, a small technical fix that made no difference to anyone except a being whose nervous system had spent 2 weeks learning to trust a stranger's voice more than his own instincts. That is what I mean when I say her competence was never loud. It built itself into the walls. Ovet trusted her almost immediately, and differently than the others, because Ovet had spent a professional lifetime being the only being on any given crew who communicated in a way nobody else fully understood. Rena had asked, on day 1, what the colors meant. She kept asking, patiently, precisely, building over weeks something close to a working vocabulary, not out of obligation, but because she seemed to find it genuinely interesting, the way some people find a new language interesting for its own sake. By week 5, Ovet had started keeping the daily water reclamation log in a small notebook of their own, pulsing the totals to Rena each evening, who would write them down beside her stones, the two of them building a private ritual of small, careful numbers that made the unknowable length of our weight feel, in some tiny way, measured. I did not fully understand, at the time, how much that mattered. I understand it now. The false dawn came in week 6, and I call it that deliberately, because that is exactly what it turned out to be. Our short-range beacon picked up a contact, a freight hauler, well within range, moving on a trajectory that would bring it close enough to receive our distress signal clearly. I remember the sound the whole command ring made when the proximity alert triggered, a ragged collective noise of hope that I had not heard from this crew in over a month. We hailed. We waited. We got a response. It was not the response we wanted. The hauler's captain, a gruff, businesslike voice belonging to a species I never did identify, informed us that they had received our beacon, logged our position and status, and would relay it to the nearest coalition rescue authority upon reaching their next port of call, 4 weeks away, along a route that did not pass back through our corridor. They did not have the fuel margin to divert. They were not equipped for a rescue of 6 personnel. They were sorry. They wished us well. They continued on their route without so much as slowing down. I want to tell you the crew took this well. I want to, because it would make for a tidier story. They did not. Bosk's plating rattled for a solid hour afterward. Alira locked herself in the cargo bay and did not emerge for a shift and a half. Ovet's carapace went the deep, held breath color I now recognized as the neural expression for grief and stayed there for the better part of 2 days. I found Rena in the observation lounge that evening, sitting in front of her stone towers, which by then numbered 41, arranged in a small careful cluster that had started, unmistakably, to resemble something like a garden. They said someone would relay the message, I said, because I did not know what else to say, and because I think I needed her to tell me it was going to be all right, even though I already suspected, from her stillness, that it was not going to be that simple. Someone might, she said. 4 weeks to get there. Then it has to sit in someone's queue. Then a rescue ship has to actually get free to come this way. That's not weeks anymore, Tan. That's months. Realistically. I sat down across from her. You don't sound surprised. I'm not. She picked up a stone, turned it over once, set it back down without adding it to the tower. Too early in the day for that, apparently, some private rule of her ritual I had never asked about. I did the math on day 1. I just didn't see the point of saying it out loud until we had to. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think it is important, and because I do not think it reflects particularly well on me. I felt something close to anger. Not at her, at the unfairness of a species that could apparently see this coming and simply chose to carry it silently, alone, for 6 weeks, while the rest of us hoped for something she had already ruled out. Why didn't you tell us? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment, and there was something in her expression I had not seen from her before, not the calm, exactly, but the cost underneath it, visible for just a moment before she folded it back away. Because hope isn't free, she said. But it's not worthless either. You just have to know when to spend it and when to save it. Everyone needed 6 weeks of hope to build the habits that are going to get us through the next 6 months. If I'd told you the real math on day 1, I don't think would have built any of it. Would have just been waiting to die efficiently instead of living while we waited. I did not have a response to that. I still am not sure I have found one, months later, writing this account. I only know that she was right, and that being right had cost her something every single day since the impact, something none of the rest of us had been asked to carry. I asked her, before I left the lounge that night, how she had carried it alone for 6 weeks without it showing. It showed, she said. You just weren't looking for it in the right place. I wasn't sleeping much either, Tan. I just didn't let anyone see that part, because it wasn't going to help anyone else sleep better. There's a difference between honesty and dumping. I told you the truth the moment I thought you could actually use it. Before that, it would have just been weight with nowhere useful to go. I sat with that for a long time after she went to her own quarters, looking out at the same stars that had watched us for 4 months by then, indifferent as ever, and I understood, I think for the first time completely, that the calm I had been quietly admiring since day 1 was not the absence of fear at all. It was a decision, remade every single day, about where to put it. She told the crew the real timeline the next morning, all at once, gathered in the observation lounge with the stone towers behind her like a small, strange monument. I watched Bosk's breathing catch and hold. I watched Alira's jaw tighten in the particular way that meant she was doing rapid, grim arithmetic. I watched Ovet's carapace flicker through 3 distinct colors before settling into something dim and steady. So here's where we actually are, Rena said, and her voice did not waver, though I suspect, now, that it cost her everything she had to keep it level. Best case, 4 to 5 months before anyone reaches us. Worst case, longer. We've got water margin for about 3 months at current rationing, if nothing else breaks. We need more margin. And we need it in a way that doesn't run out. Alira spoke first, her voice flat. You've known this for 6 weeks. I have. And you didn't say anything. I didn't. I braced for the argument I assumed was coming. Alira had earned the right to that anger, I thought, more than any of us. But she surprised me. She looked at the stone towers, 41 stones, 41 days survived in a rhythm that had held the whole crew together, and something in her expression shifted. That's the coldest, most calculated thing I've ever watched someone do out of kindness, she said finally. It was not quite forgiveness. It was something adjacent to it, which, from Alira, amounted to nearly the same thing. Where do we get more water margin? Bosk asked, and his voice, though still tight, had steadied into something functional. Rena looked toward the corridor that led, for decks down, to a small horticultural bay with 6 growing trays and a climate system she had rebuilt 3 weeks earlier for reasons she had described, at the time, only as everything's essential eventually. I have an idea, she said. It's going to take everyone. The greenhouse expansion took 11 days, and I am going to tell you about it in some detail, because it is the piece of this story that most people, when I have shared it since, find hardest to believe, not because it is dramatic, but because it is so thoroughly, unglamorously ordinary, and because ordinary sustained effort turns out to be a much rarer thing in this galaxy than anyone gives it credit for. Renner's plan was simple in concept and brutal in execution. The 6-tray horticultural bay could not, on its own, produce enough biomass to meaningfully extend our water reclamation margin. But the station had other unused space, 2 decommissioned storage bays on Deck 4 and 5, sealed and empty since before I took command, that could, with enough work, be converted into additional growing space. More plants meant more water cycling through a closed loop instead of sitting stagnant in our tanks. More plants meant more oxygen scrubbing, which meant less strain on our mechanical systems, which meant those systems would last longer before failing entirely. It was not a solution. It was a multiplier on the time we had left, and in a crisis with no fixed end date, a multiplier on time was the only currency that mattered. The work itself was not heroic. It was hauling salvaged piping through narrow corridors. It was Bosk, whose claustrophobia made every hour in those sealed, half-lit storage bays a genuine ordeal, showing up anyway, every shift, because Renner had asked him to, specifically, by name, telling him his strength was the actual bottleneck on the whole project and that she needed him more than she needed anyone else on the crew for this particular job. I do not know if that was strictly true. I know that Bosk worked 11 straight days in the space he feared most in the universe, and that his plating stopped rattling somewhere around day 6, not because the fear left, but because he had built, alongside it, a reason bigger than the fear. It was Alira running the numbers, over and over, recalculating margins as each new tray came online, translating uncertainty into figures precise enough that even a Kailu's contract-shaped mind could hold onto them without panic. She stopped being skeptical of Renner somewhere around day 4 of that project, though she never said so directly. I only noticed that she had started, without being asked, adding a stone to the windowsill tower every evening on Renner's behalf on the 2 occasions Renner herself was too exhausted to make the walk. It was Ovette mapping the irrigation loop with a precision no other member of the crew could have matched, translating plant biology into flow calculations, spending long silent hours beside Renner in the growing bays, the 2 of them communicating in a shorthand of scribbled numbers and careful color pulses that had, by then, become something close to a private language. And it was Renner, every single day, doing the parts nobody else could do and the parts nobody else wanted to do in equal measure, going to bed later than anyone and rising before most of us, until day 9, when I found her asleep sitting upright against an irrigation housing, a wrench still loose in her hand, and understood, watching her, that the calm I had been so admiring for 6 weeks was not free. It had never been free. She had simply decided, every single day, to spend her own reserve so the rest of us would not have to spend ours. I did not wake her. I sat down across from her in the quiet, half-lit bay, and for the first time since the impact, I let myself simply not know what to do next, the way she must have been doing, silently, every day since the shuttle that was supposed to take her onward had never come. The expansion finished on day 52, Station Reckoning. 22 growing trays instead of 6. A water reclamation margin that had, by Alira's most conservative math, roughly doubled. Not a rescue. Not an ending. Just more time, purchased with 11 days of unglamorous, aching, ordinary labor. Renner added a stone to the tower that evening, same as always, no ceremony, though the whole crew had gathered in the observation lounge to watch her do it, an audience for a ritual that had never asked for one. That's 52, Bosk said, looking at the towers, which had grown, by then, into something almost architectural, clusters and spirals that Ovette had started arranging with quiet, deliberate care during idle moments, a shared project none of us had planned or announced. 52, Renner agreed. Long way from done. Doesn't feel that way tonight, Alira said, and there was something in her voice I had not heard from her before. Not comfort, exactly. Kailu do not deal comfortably in comfort, but something close enough to count. I want to tell you this was the turning point, the moment the story becomes simple, the crisis fully solved. It was not. We still had months ahead of us. We still did not know, with any certainty, when help would come, or whether our margins would hold long enough for it to matter. But something had shifted in that lounge, on that particular evening, that I did not fully understand until much later, writing this account, turning the pieces over the way Renner used to turn her stones. It was this: we had stopped waiting for the crisis to end, and started living inside it instead. She had done that. Quietly, deliberately, one ordinary task at a time, for 52 days, without once telling us how much it cost her to hold the line while we learned to hold it ourselves. I wish I could tell you the rest of the wait was easy, now that the habits were built and the margins were wider. It was not. Long crises do not work that way. They erode you in places you did not know you had, slowly, in ways that are hard to notice until something finally gives. The thing that finally gave, in our case, was Bosk, in week 11, roughly 79 days into the blackout. It was not the confinement, this time. He had, by then, genuinely adapted to the storage bays, the corridors, the whole sealed architecture of our situation, in a way that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. It was something quieter and, I think, more dangerous, the accumulated weight of not knowing, stretched out for 11 weeks with no fixed end in sight, finally settling somewhere it could no longer be worked around. I found him in the cargo bay, sitting against a bulkhead, not moving, his plating utterly still in a way that alarmed me more than any tremor would have. I called for Rena over the station comm, and she arrived within minutes, and I watched her approach him the way she had approached him that first time, weeks earlier, not crowding him, not performing concern at him, just present, low, steady. "I keep doing the math," Bosk said, and his voice, when it finally came, sounded scrape thin. "Every day I do the math. Water, power, air. And every day the numbers hold. And I don't believe them anymore. I keep waiting for the day they don't hold, and I can't. I don't know how to keep waiting for a day I can't see coming." Rena sat down across from him, close enough that he could see her, far enough that she was not pressing in on the space he needed. "You're right," she said. "You can't see it coming. Neither can I. I don't know when help gets here, Bosk. I never did. I've been guessing this whole time, same as you." I watched something crack, very slightly, in Bosk's stillness. Not relief, exactly, but the particular relief of being told the truth by someone who had, until that moment, seemed to carry certainty the rest of us did not have. "Then how do you keep doing it?" he asked. "Every day. How do you keep getting up and doing the next thing when you don't know if the next thing even matters?" Rena was quiet for a long moment, and I understood, watching her, that this was the question underneath every stone on that windowsill, the real answer she had been building toward for 11 weeks instead of simply stating out loud, because some answers only mean something once you have lived long enough to need them. "Because not knowing when it ends isn't the same as it never ending," she said finally. "It just means I don't get to see the whole shape of the weight yet. I only get to see today. So I do today as well as I can, and I trust that enough todays add up to an ending, even the ones where I can't see it yet." She nodded toward the corridor, toward the observation lounge 4 decks up, toward the towers of stone that had, by then, become something like a shrine to 80 days survived. Every one of those stones was a day I didn't know the end of, either. And I'm still here. So are you. That's not luck, Bosk. That's just what showing up adds up to, eventually, if you don't stop. Bosk did not answer immediately. He sat with it, the way he sat with most things, slowly, thoroughly, in his own time. And then, without a word, he stood, walked the 4 decks to the observation lounge with Rena beside him, and added a stone to the tower himself. Day 79, a day he had, moments before, believed he could not survive. I did not understand, until much later, how close we had come that day to losing something we would not have gotten back. I understood it fully only in hindsight, the way you understand most of the important moments in a long crisis, not while they are happening, but afterward, when you finally have the distance to see the shape of what almost broke. Before I tell you about the failure, I want to tell you about week 13, because it is the piece of this account I nearly left out, and because I think leaving it out would make everything that follows harder to believe. Elira Thess did not talk about her life before the coalition. I had served alongside her for 6 years by the time the asteroid hit us, and in that time I could count on one hand the personal details she had volunteered. Kailu culture, from what little I understood of it, treated unshared history as a kind of currency you did not spend carelessly, and Elira spent nothing carelessly. She told Rena, in week 13, sitting in the cargo bay during one of the informal mealtimes that had, by then, become simply how the crew ate, that she had grown up on a trade convoy, not a homeworld, one of a string of Kailu vessels that moved goods along routes too dangerous or too unprofitable for the larger corporate lines. Her family had lost a ship, once, to a fuel shortage in a dead stretch of unclaimed space, 3 weeks from the nearest port, with supplies calculated for 11 days. "We made it," she said, when Rena asked, in the careful, unhurried way she asked most things. "Obviously. I'm here. But I remember what my mother did, those 3 weeks. She rationed everything down to units so small it felt insulting. She made us log every scrap we used, like it mattered, like anyone was ever going to read the log. I hated her for it at the time. I thought it was her being cruel for the sake of being thorough. And now? Rena asked. Alira was quiet for a long moment, turning a data slate over in her hands the way Rena turned her stones. Now I think she was doing exactly what you've been doing, she said, giving the weight a shape small enough to hold. I just didn't have the words for it until I watched you do the same thing to 6 species who had no reason to trust each other. It was, as far as I know, the most Alira Thess ever said about her own history to anyone aboard Meridian Relay 7, before or since. She did not offer it as comfort, and I do not think Rena took it as comfort exactly either. I think it was something closer to recognition. One person who had survived a long wait, telling another person who was in the middle of building one, that the method was older and more common than either of them had assumed. After that conversation, Alira's morale check INS changed. She had treated the task, for the first month, as a chore to be completed efficiently and reported on precisely, corridor by corridor, the way she might audit a shipping manifest. She began, after week 13, actually sitting with people. I found her once, midway through a shift, in the horticultural bay with Ovette, the two of them working through the nutrient logs together in near total silence, Alira occasionally reading a number aloud and waiting, patiently, for the corresponding pulse of color, learning a language that was not required of her, for no reason except that it seemed to matter to someone she had decided, finally, to trust. I mention all of this because I think it is easy, telling a story like this one, to make it sound as though Rena Achebe did all the work of holding 6 people together across 134 days, and I do not want to leave you with that impression, because it would not be true, and because I do not think she would want it told that way either. What she did, more than anything else, was go first. She built the first habit, carried the first hard truth, sat with the first person whose fear threatened to become something worse. But by week 13, the weight had genuinely begun to distribute itself across all 6 of us, the way weight is supposed to, in a crew that has finally learned how to be one. The failure came in week 15, and it was, in its own way, the thing we had all been quietly dreading since the day the real timeline had been laid bare in that lounge. A secondary power coupling, already weakened by the original impact, finally gave out entirely, taking a significant portion of our water reclamation capacity with it. Alira ran the new numbers within the hour, her voice steady in the way that meant she had already gone past panic and out the other side into something colder and more useful. At current margins, factoring the greenhouse expansion, we have 11 days, she said. After that, we are rationing below sustainable levels. 11 days. Against a rescue window that remained, by every estimate we had, at least 6 to 8 weeks out, if the freight captain's math and the coalition's Q held anything close to true. I will not pretend the room did not feel the floor drop out from under it. I felt it myself, and I had, by then, spent nearly 4 months learning to hold steady the way Rena had taught the rest of us, without ever quite matching her for it. She did not have an answer immediately. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters more than a version of this story where she simply produces a solution instantly, out of some inexhaustible reserve the rest of us do not have access to. She sat with the number, 11 days, the way I had watched her sit with hard numbers before, turning it over the way she turned her stones. The greenhouse, she said finally. How much of our reclamation loss can the plants absorb if we max the growing cycles? Force them, skip the slow stages, except we lose some yield efficiency for speed. Ovette was already pulsing calculations before she finished the sentence, the two of them falling into the shorthand they had built over months of shared, careful work. It took them the better part of a day to land on the plan, and it was not a clean solution. Forcing the growth cycles meant burning through nutrient reserves faster than intended, meant accepting a narrower future margin in exchange for buying us past the immediate 11-day crisis, meant, essentially, spending tomorrow's safety to purchase today's survival, and trusting that the coupling could be jury-rigged, eventually, with parts Bosk was fairly sure he could fabricate from salvage, given enough time. Enough time, Alira repeated, when Bosk said it, something almost like dark humor threading through the words. That's the one thing we don't actually have. Then we buy some, Rena said. That's what we've been doing the whole time. I am not going to walk you through every hour of the 6 days that followed, because it would be, frankly, exhausting to recount and exhausting to hear. 6 days of forced growing cycles, of Bosk fabricating coupling components from salvage with a precision his hands had never been asked for before, of Alira recalculating margins hourly as each variable shifted, of Ovette monitoring nutrient levels around the clock in shifts so tight I finally ordered them, on day 4, to rest, and order they. Ignored twice before finally, reluctantly, obeying. I will give you 2 moments from those 6 days, though, because I think they tell you more about what actually happened than any summary could. The first was on day 3, when Bosk's fabrication attempt failed for the second time, the coupling housing warping under stress in a way that meant 2 full days of salvage work had produced nothing usable. I found him in the machine shop afterward, sitting very still in front of the ruined component, and I braced myself for the tremor, the plating rattle, the old fear returning under the weight of a fresh failure. It did not come. He looked at the warp housing for a long moment, then reached for a fresh sheet of salvage plating and began marking out the cut lines again, slower this time, more careful. "Third time," he said, when he noticed me watching. "Not the first hard thing I've had to try 3 times this year." He did not say Renner's name. He did not need to. The method had become his own by then, worn into him the way a habit wears itself into muscle, and he built the third housing with a steadiness that would have been unthinkable to the Bosk Farron of week 1, the one who had needed a voice in the dark just to keep his breathing even. The second moment was smaller, and I nearly did not think to include it, except that I have not been able to stop thinking about it since. On day 5, deep into the forced growing cycle, Renner and Ovette were working a joint shift in the horticultural bay, monitoring nutrient uptake in trays that had been pushed well past their intended tolerances. I came down to check on them near the end of the shift and found Renner asleep sitting upright against a growing rack, exhausted past the point of choice, and Ovette sitting beside her, motionless, carapace dimmed to a low, careful glow, keeping watch over the readouts alone rather than wake her. When I asked, later, why they hadn't simply logged the shift as complete and gone to rest together, Ovette's answer came through in a long, deliberate sequence of color I had, by then, spent 4 months learning to read. It meant, as close as I have ever been able to translate it, she went first for all of us. It was my turn to let her rest. I did not have a response to that either. I have found, writing this account, that there are a great many moments in this story I did not have a response to, and I have come to think that is simply what it feels like to watch a species do something your own species has not yet learned how to name. I will tell you about day 6, because it is the day that mattered. The coupling held, on the first test, by a margin so narrow Alira later told me she had genuinely not expected it to work. The forced growing cycles had done their job, holding our reclamation numbers just above the line that separated sustainable from catastrophic, buying us the weeks we needed for the fix to matter. We gathered in the observation lounge that evening, all 6 of us, in front of the stone towers, which had grown, over 4 months, into something genuinely beautiful in their strangeness, spirals and small careful arches that Ovette had spent long idle hours building, day markers turned, slowly, into architecture, into a monument none of us had set out to build and none of us could now imagine the lounge without. Renner added the day's stone. Then, without a word, she reached into her bag and took out the last of them, a small handful of stones I had not realized she was still carrying in reserve, and set them, all at once, into the base of the largest tower. "What's that for?" Bosk asked. "Buffer," she said. "In case some days are too hard to walk down here and add one properly. I wanted there to always be enough, even on the days when there isn't enough of anything else." I looked at that tower for a long time that evening, all 4 months of it, every stone a day none of us had known the end of when we lived it, and I understood, finally, the actual shape of what she had built. Not a rescue. Not a solution. A way of surviving the unsolved, one ordinary day at a time, for as long as the unsolved lasted. The rescue ship came on day 131. I want to tell you it arrived dramatically, in a burst of light and relief, the way rescues arrive in the stories other species tell about themselves. It did not. It arrived quietly, a routine coalition patrol vessel diverted after our beacon signal finally worked its way up through a queue that had, in the end, taken almost exactly as long as Renner's original, unspoken estimate had suggested it would. We had power for full communications restored by then. Bosk and Ovette had managed a partial repair to the long-range array in week 19, enough to send a clear signal, though not enough to receive much back beyond simple acknowledgement. So we knew help was finally, actually coming 3 days before it arrived, which gave us time to do something I do not think any of us expected to feel the need to do. We went, all 6 of us, to the observation lounge, and we looked at the stone towers together, 128 stones by then, plus the small reserve buffer Renner had built into the base, and nobody said very much, because there was not, really, very much that needed saying. "We are going to have to leave those," Alira said eventually, and there was something genuinely mournful in her voice that I would not have believed, for months earlier, a Kailu trader capable of producing. "We are not," Renner said. She had, it turned out, already thought about this, the way she seemed to think about everything slightly before the rest of us realized we needed to. I asked the rescue captain. There's room. We're taking the towers with us. All of them. I do not know what became, eventually, of 131 small stones arranged into towers by a crew that had needed them to survive a weight none of us had chosen and none of us could have carried alone. I know that when we finally boarded the rescue vessel, Bosk carried the largest tower himself, cradled against his chest with a care I had never once seen from him in 19 years, and that Ovet's carapace, watching him do it, cycled slowly through nearly every color I had learned to read over 4 months, before settling, finally, on the deep warm gold I had come to understand meant something very close to I will remember this. Renner Achebe left Meridian Relay 7 3 days after the rescue vessel arrived, transferred onward to the mining colony that had been, 134 days earlier, only a 6-hour layover away. She thanked me by name, at the airlock, the way she had thanked the shuttle pilot the first day I ever saw her. You ran a good station through a bad stretch, Tan, she said. I mean that. I told her, honestly, that the station had run itself, mostly, and that whatever had actually held us together through 131 unknown days had come from her, not from me, and that I did not fully understand how one person carried that kind of weight for that long without ever once setting it down where the rest of us could see the cost of it. She considered that for a moment, the way she considered most things, unhurried, turning it over. I didn't carry it alone, she said. That's the part people always get wrong about this. I just carried it first, until everyone else learned how to carry their own piece of it. That's all it ever is. Somebody has to go first, and then it isn't one person's weight anymore. It's just the weight everyone agreed to share. She shook my hand, one firm motion, and stepped through the airlock, canvas bag over one shoulder, the same bag she had arrived with 134 days earlier, though I noticed, watching her go, that it looked considerably lighter than it had that first day. I understood why, a moment later, when I turned back toward the observation lounge and saw what she had left behind. Not the towers. Those had gone with Bosk, with Ovet, packed with more care than half our actual salvageable cargo. She had left, instead, a single stone, sitting alone on the windowsill where the towers used to stand, day 134, the last stone from her bag, set down deliberately, the way she set everything down. I have never moved it. It sits there still, on the windowsill of the observation lounge on Meridian Relay 7, the one place on this station where you can still look out at the stars and remember exactly how long a wait can be, and exactly how ordinary the thing is that gets you through it. I filed my official report to the Coalition Administrative Council 2 weeks after the rescue, and I want to end this account the way I ended that report, because I have not found better words since, and I have had a long time to look. I wrote that humans are not, as some of our older records suggest, a species defined chiefly by aggression or improvisation under sudden threat. I wrote that what I witnessed over 134 days was something slower and, I think, considerably more dangerous to underestimate, and species built, through some long, hard accounting in their own history, for enduring what has no visible end. Not fighting the unknown. Outlasting it. One deliberately ordinary day at a time, for as long as it takes, without ever once needing an audience to keep doing it. I recommended, in that report, that any coalition species facing a crisis with no fixed timeline, famine, blockade, long-haul isolation, anything the rest of us are built to fear precisely because we cannot see its edges, consider, seriously, whether a human happens to be nearby. Not because they will save you quickly. Because they will not let the waiting be the thing that beats you, and in my long experience running a station out here in the cold and the dark, that has turned out to matter a great deal more than speed ever did. Somewhere out there, Renner Achebe is very likely filing routine mining reports, complaining about the food, and stacking small stones on some windowsill nobody else has learned to notice yet. I have thought a great deal, in the time since, about how to explain what happened aboard Meridian Relay 7 to people who were not there for it, and I keep arriving at the same difficulty. It is easy to tell a story about a fight. A fight has a beginning, a climax, an ending, a clear moment where you can point and say, there, that is where everything changed. Our story did not have that moment. It had 131 ordinary ones, stacked one on top of the other, none of them individually remarkable, all of them together amounting to the difference between a crew that survived and a crew that simply endured until it did not. I think that is the part of this account that unsettles people most, when I share it, and I have come to understand why. A species that wins through a single dramatic act of courage is a species you can prepare for. You study the act, you learn its shape, you build a defense or a countermeasure or, if you are wise, an alliance. but a species that wins by simply refusing to stop showing up, day after day, for as long as it takes, with no need for anyone to witness it and no guarantee it will ever end. That is a much harder thing to plan around. You cannot out-escalate patience. You cannot intimidate a species whose baseline response to an unsolvable problem is to solve today's smaller piece of it and go to sleep, and then get up and do it again. I do not say this to suggest humans are without fear, because Renna told me herself, plainly, more than once, that she was afraid nearly the entire time. I do not say it to suggest they are without limits, because I watched, more closely than I think she ever realized, exactly how much her calm cost her, night after night, long after the rest of the crew had gone to rest. What I am saying is something narrower and, I think, more important. Humans appear to have built, somewhere in their long and apparently difficult history, a genuine skill for surviving the specific kind of suffering that has no visible end: the drought, the siege, the long dark stretch between one certainty and the next, and they built it not through any single extraordinary person, but through an ordinary method that any ordinary person among them seems able to learn and pass on to others, given the chance. That, I have come to believe, is the actual finding buried in my report, underneath all the specifics about stones and greenhouses and stubborn Drenic haulers who learn to work through their Fear 1 salvage panel at a time. Not that Renna Achabe was exceptional, though she was, in her quiet way, extraordinary, but that she did not need to be exceptional for what she taught the rest of us to matter. She only needed to go first, consistently, for long enough that the rest of us learned the shape of it well enough to carry our own share. I still keep her note, folded behind the biometric printouts nobody else reads. I still have not moved the single stone on the observation lounge windowsill, day 134, sitting alone where a small forest of towers used to stand. New crew members ask about it sometimes, when they rotate through Meridian Relay 7 and notice it for the first time, one plain stone on an otherwise empty sill, and I tell them the short version of this story, the part that fits in a few sentences, because the whole of it takes longer to tell than most people have patience for. Which I suppose, in the end, is rather the point. Somewhere out there, Renna Achabe is very likely filing routine mining reports, complaining about the food, and stacking small stones on some windowsill nobody else has learned to notice yet. I do not envy whoever eventually finds out why. I only hope, when they do, that they have the sense to sit down beside her and ask what the stones are for.